back to Money Talks. I'm Mia Lee, escort, stripper, CPA, and recovered banker. So today we have a Q&A episode. I had promised viewers that I would collect all the questions in the comments and suggestions for future content, and I would do a Q&A episode roughly every 10 episodes. Here I am doing my Q&A. So the first question is, how much money would you suggest having saved before you start investing? This is going to depend a lot on your short and long-term cash needs. I would say as a general rule, don't invest money that you can't afford to lose. If you feel comfortable potentially losing money on investments after you say have 6 months of living expenses, then start investing after that. If that number is 3 months or 1 year for you, then start investing after that. Investment professionals typically recommend people have anywhere from 3 to 8 months of living expenses in liquid securities like cash equivalents. I personally am sitting on something like 1 year of expenses in cash equivalents, but that's not necessarily based on my investment profile and risk tolerance. That's just because my cash equivalents combination of the money that I think I would need to continue running my life and business if I had a downturn, but also money that I plan on potentially wiring out to make private investments. If I were to really try to decide how much money I want to save for emergency funds before I start investing overall, I'd say for me that's probably about 3 months because I'm kind of workaholic. I don't tend to take a lot of time off if I'm being really honest. But if you know yourself and you tend to take more time off, or if you have health problems, you might want to up that 3 months to maybe 6 or even 12 months, depending on what your past cash needs have been. The main thing about investing is remember that this is money that you could lose. Don't invest anything that you can't afford to lose. Another question I got is whether or not it's worth it to try to register your business entity in a lower tax state if you live in a higher tax state like New York. I would say no, because it's essentially tax evasion, which is very, very illegal and absolutely a felony to try not to pay taxes that you actually owe. If you look in the news, you can see companies getting in trouble for this by, let's say, registering in Ireland or some other country that has lower taxes in order to not pay US taxes. Now, that's at the international level, but this probably also applies to like interstate commerce and whatnot. If all of your business is done in New York and you're a dancer in New York, or you're an escort in New York, and then you register in Texas, which has no state income tax, it's gonna beg the question if you get audited, like, what are you doing in Texas and why should you not owe New York taxes? I mean, New York tax regulation is pretty specific that if you do business in New York, you have to pay New York taxes. I'm not seeing the benefit of registering in a lower tax state because it's not like you do business in that state. So you're not really going to benefit from being in a low or no tax state. You still owe taxes in the state that you make that money in. Another question I got is about hiring registered agents to keep your information off the record. Yes, there are services that will register your business entity, LLC, or other business entity for you and serve as a registered agent. There are new federal disclosure rules that I talked about in a previous episode. I'm not sure if the federal disclosures are searchable to the public. That might only be searchable to the federal government or the Treasury Department. But having a registered agent as of pre-Corporate Transparency Act would shield your information from public searches, assuming that you register in a state that doesn't require disclosure of beneficial ownership. I know for certain in New York, which is where I live, the new transparency law that was enacted specific to New York requires publicly searchable beneficial ownership for all business entities, right? So that's not going to help you if you live and work in New York because you have to disclose that pursuant to New York law. But this might be a different situation if you live in a state that doesn't have these disclosure requirements. You could still use a registered agent to stay anonymous to the general public, even though that state's Department of State will know who you are and what your business address is and your identifying information. A potential client, other interested party, usually for nefarious reasons, will not be able to look you up and find out what your real name is. Another question that I got is, it seems really complicated to do LLC formation. Is there a service that I'd recommend? I would take a look at the IRS website. There's a service that I've used in the past. It's called Northwest Registered Agents. They're fine, they're not too expensive, and they did the trick for me. And I actually registered a business that was not a sex work business. I have never registered my sex work business and probably will never do. Another question I got was, bank compliance seems kind of crazy. I had an OnlyFans account and I was only doing online work, all of which is legal, but Cash App still shut down my account. Cash App, keep in mind, is a payment platform and not a bank. They're actually affiliated with Sutton Bank, and Cash App has specific terms of service that prohibit selling of adult content and services. That's a direct quote from their TOS. Pornography and other obscene materials, including literature, imagery, and other media, certainly qualify as explicit content and would be barred from Cash App's usage per their TOS. Banks don't necessarily have the same terms of service. I certainly had the experience that my bank, which is one of the major banks in the United States, has not had any issues with me being an adult entertainer. But yeah, Cash App is separate from banks. Another question I got is whether or not OnlyFans counts as direct deposit. Honestly, I'm not really sure because I haven't really had this issue in my individual life. I'd be curious what the viewers say about this. The reason it's relevant is like you get certain perks on different checking accounts and you get free checking if you have direct deposits. I guess it would be helpful if OnlyFans counted as a direct deposit the same way that like a W-2 job would direct deposit into your account. OnlyFans does regularly deposit every week, I think it is. I would think it would count as a direct deposit, but I'm going to defer to user comments on this and ask my viewers whether or not they have found that OnlyFans direct deposits qualify as direct deposits for the purposes of getting free checking or any of these other bank perks that rely on direct deposits. And finally, the last question that I'm going to answer, by the way, I'm only answering questions from members of my community. So if you're just like some dude that's trying to sell services to adult entertainers, like you can bug all the way off because I don't care about your questions. In any event, I got a question from somebody asking that I come across as really genuine. They're just curious how, since prostitution is illegal in New York, how am I able to admit to being an escort on camera and be so public? This person's asking this question because they're wondering whether or not they can do it too. If so, how? New York City is very different than a lot of other places across the United States, where a few years ago, the last district attorney that we had in Manhattan, where I live, came out and very publicly stated that he was not going to prosecute prostitution offenses or solicitation offenses. You basically have de facto decrim in Manhattan. That's not necessarily true everywhere, certainly not true across certain parts of the South. Texas is very strict about this kind of stuff. But being a Manhattan resident, from a legal standpoint, I don't have to worry about being arrested for what I do for a living because the DA came out, and the current DA actually reiterated this statement. Like, there is just a lot of publicity around New York de facto decriminalizing solicitation or prostitution. And as a result, I'm able to operate very openly as a sex worker. Now, that doesn't mean that I can open a merchant bank account because my bank still can't support that because they're subject to federal requirements around illegal activities. So I still can't have a merchant account with my bank. But I am able to be face out and publicly state that I am a sex worker, that I do in-person sex work, which in most parts of the United States is not fully legal. That wraps up my Q&A. Let me know if I missed anything. I'm Mia Lee. You can take the girl off Wall Street, but you can't take the banker out of the hole. Drop me more questions and comments for future Q&A episodes. Thanks so much for listening.